Hello everyone. Today we get to look at Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, developed by Ninja Theory. If you haven't played this game and are interested, I would highly recommend you play this before watching the video. There are plenty of areas in the game that are best experienced firsthand. A lot of what makes this game stand out stems from its sound design and the representation of a mental disorder, which I will get to later on. If you haven't played yet, this video might not do it justice, so I recommend playing it with quality headphones. In this video I will discuss some nitpicks I have with the game, the sound and visual design, the puzzles, the combat, and my interpretations on some of the deeper aspects of the game's story. With that out of the way, let's talk about Hellblade. I first need to explain that there are two ways I'm approaching this review: what it is trying to accomplish as an art form, and how it plays as a video game. The latter doesn't need much context, but the former does. Senua has a deep form of psychosis, which causes her to have delusions, hallucinations, and disturbing thoughts. The developers of the game worked hard to represent the mental illness as best as possible. It feels kind of dirty to take everything at face value and not offer some examination of any deeper meanings, so I will attempt that when the time comes. I have a surprising amount to say about this opening sequence. I've said before that any form of media requires a trust in the creator from the viewer or player that paying attention and staying engaged when you might not be fully invested will pay off. You could say patience is a virtue in these kinds of cases. As the developer of a video game, you should also be aware of potentially taking advantage of that trust from the player. This opening credit sequence is just too long. When playing a second time, with more interest and investment in the game at the beginning, I still found my eyes glazing over. This sequence establishes the many voices in Senua's head and creates a tense and foreboding mood. The player seems to be another voice joining in as one of the others elucidates us on Senua and her struggles. This backstory and the voices have been established within the first minute. It drags on another 6 minutes. The only control we have so far is moving the camera, which is used to scan the environment, and see lots and lots of corpses on sticks and hung around. This would normally be completely engrossing due to the voices being a new and creepy thing to experience, as well as the long brooding reveal of death you see. However, there is a limit of how long I can stay interested while slowly panning the camera around. At first I wondered who the heck would be putting these bodies on stakes all over the place, but the more I think about it, the less I'm convinced they're even real. Probably just in Senua's head. The first bit of gameplay is walking and focusing on a stone that explains Nordic lore, and I don't think it was a smart idea to lead with this after the long boat ride. Audio logs in video games are a method of telling the backstory that is very difficult to get right. As far as I can tell, the best way to hear all of the audio from the stones is to focus on it and stand completely still, waiting for it to finish. This kills the pacing and inspires boredom. You can see here how I thought it would keep playing as I walked.
That leads north and down through deep, dark valleys. After 9 nights of climbing.
It does initially. This is an experiential game, so there are a lot of invisible lines that trigger something when Senua crosses them. Be it her voices act up or her psychosis triggers some visual horror. I respect prioritizing the experience portion of the game over the lore stone audio, but this isn't the best trade-off. Unfortunately, your choices are to either kill your pacing and hear some cool stories, or keep going and potentially harm your experience by having multiple audio tracks fight over each other or miss out on the lore. Watch how on this stone, there's literally nothing the player can do differently but wait until the current voice in her head is done talking before activating and hearing the lore.
The longer it burned, the more she convinced herself that there was nothing beyond its reach. How little separates us from what we fear.
Let's him hear Sigurd's newfound power. Let's him hear.
With how frequent this issue arises, I have to believe someone on the team pointed this out, but couldn't find a solution, so they left it. At the very least, they should have done some testing. Find the amount of time the lore stone talks, jog Senua as far away from the lore stone in that time in all directions. Once the audio ends, mark that spot Senua ended up on the map. That's the earliest a new audio event should occur. This would assure that players who want to jog instead of walk don't miss out on anything. The cherry on top of this issue is the fact that there's no reason this even had to be tied to the stones. This could have just been audio that talks like the voices in her head do. The stories from Druth about the Nordic lands were told to her long ago, so she is remembering them anyway. The stones don't mean anything, and interacting with them is not engaging. Shortly after we get into the open, we come to a ravine we have to cross. I was delighted to be able to fall to my death. The first thing I do in any video game with a narrow walkway is see if I can fall off. If I can't at all, I lose all emotional investment and whatever tense emotion that it could have evoked. Hellblade passes this test. The test of being able to die. It's not perfect though. You really have to hold the control stick to the side for a long time for her to fall. If you release it before she does fall, she recovers. Still, better than nothing. The first bit of combat in the game is a required failure state, and if you don't die naturally, the game makes the enemies impossible to hit. Not the best feeling, but it doesn't break my immersion or anything. What does break my immersion is what happens afterwards. It's said that the rot, if it gets to Senua's head, will kill her, and you will lose all your progress. This has already been tested before. I don't have footage of myself dying to the same enemy 50 times, but just know that this isn't true. Well, see, that's the thing. It being untrue fits with Senua's psychosis perfectly. We are being lied to about the rot, just like Senua is. With how it's presented, though, through non-diegetic text, it breaks the consistent diegetic-only style the game has had so far. This issue is trickier than it first appears. Getting the player in the same headspace as Senua is important, and the player has no reason to not trust the developer talking directly to the player about a game mechanic. But if we are to be experiencing everything through Senua's eyes and ears, she wouldn't have seen this message. But would the player have trusted her if she was the one that said it? If Senua said, "If this rock gets to my head, I will die," does that even convey to the player the exact mechanic the game is trying to trick us into thinking it has? Her saying that wouldn't tell us that our progress will be erased. I've thought about this for a long time, and my conclusion is that this was a necessary evil. It's just unfortunate that players might know it's a lie beforehand. Maybe I've even ruined it for someone. Sorry, friendo. After this sequence, we get a choice of which door and trial to face first. I like choices, even if they don't meaningfully change the outcome of a character or story. Giving the player an option on what to do next is a good idea. Player agency is important. However, it seems clear that Ninja Theory didn't take into account when players don't go through the game like they expected. Remember that lore stone in the beginning of the game I talked about earlier? After getting out and into the open, I went back to see if I could listen to it again. The game was not prepared for the player to want to do that. It was like the game got confused, so it just redid the scripted sequence that happened earlier. I would have thought this would be a slam dunk. All you'd have to do is, anytime that it appears Senua is walking away, like really far away from where she should be going, the voices should taunt her relentlessly about being too scared. This instead felt like I was rewinding a movie. Another time was when I was lost and went the wrong way for a bit. I'm assuming this area wasn't the right way to go, but watch how jarring this transition is. These invisible set-piece events probably shouldn't be so abrupt. On the topic of being pedantic, what is it with double doors in every piece of media? Why does every character, including Senua, have to push both open at the same time? Is that what you do when you open a double door? Next time you see a double door in a game or a movie, see if the character opens one or both doors. The nice thing about opening double doors is you get to see how gorgeous the other side is. The art design and graphics of Hellblade are stellar. The opening shot of the bridge is fantastic. I have a fascination with bridges as it is, but walking under this humongous structure a good hour or so before we have to cross it is a great idea. It's an image that will stay in your mind. The gigantic bird structure that comes into view is striking as well. Walking through the river of blood while hands are grasping all around you feels creepy. You even get to walk up a skinless person's arm. This area in general is just a standout in the game. It looks so visually distinct from the other areas, it's a treat. Senua's character design is great as well. The flashback sequences where she is clean really show you how much of a transformation she has had since then. There's a lot of dirt and blood all over her. It really looks like she's been struggling for a while. Even in the beginning of the game to the end of the game, her journey in this land has added scars both mental and physical. One of the most complimentary things I can say about this game is it has focus. I didn't need to go into menus to check stats or skills, I didn't need to attempt to explore the map for collectibles, and there's barely any load times. The focus is always on Senua and her struggles. So far up to this point, I was kind of in between on the story and Senua as a character. That all changed during this flashback sequence. This was all it took, and I was hooked. This is an example of a time where sticking to a game you might not be 100% invested in early on pays off tremendously. I was dead set on getting Dillion back alive, because I finally understood what Dillion means to Senua. He seems to be a light in a never-ending sea of darkness that is Senua's mind and life. I was fooled along with her that bringing him back alive was going to happen, if only because I sympathized with Senua so strongly. The real-time transitions in the game are superb, impressing me every time, and this is no exception. The transition from her memory to current time is outstanding. Happy and loving past to harrowing and abhorrent present. It's one of the only times I can recollect enjoying a flashback sequence this much. I can't praise this enough. Something I wish I could praise more are the puzzles. The game has a few puzzle types it throws at the player. Find the hidden in plain sight symbol, walk around and open a door from the other side, find the correct place to stand to make structures appear, and unique trials. Not a whole lot, but it takes up a shocking amount of the playtime. I'll talk about the trials in a minute. First, the basic puzzles. The puzzles where you find hidden symbols can be interesting, but when you're slowly jogging around the map, wandering aimlessly, it can get annoying and unfortunately boring. One positive note about these ones, this is genuinely a real thing people with schizophrenia go through. Pareidolia is the tendency for people to see patterns or faces in otherwise mundane objects. It's nice to see their hearts were in the right place when including these, but it sometimes feels like padding. I joked about one of the puzzles being opening a door from the other side, but honestly that seemed to be a lot of what you did. The best inclusion was in Helheim, where you have to light a torch on one side before rushing to slam the gate down and end up in the light you created. All of the other ones don't really offer much reward when figuring it out. Both of these types of minor puzzles are fine in moderation, but they happened a bit too often for my liking. I would sometimes get frustrated when seeing yet another symbol puzzle for me to solve. Some of the frustration can be tied to how slow you move. I know a pretty big part of this game is a walking simulator, and in those types of games you tend to walk on the slow side, but sometimes I lose all interest while walking. Sometimes I became so bored my brain went on autopilot and went the wrong way, meaning I had to walk slowly back and try again.
But from the flames, a new man stepped forward, and Druth was born. Druth. The man that I am now.
Speaking of going slow and filling time, look at how long it takes to get back to the main gate to the bridge after I defeated Cert. I think I understand the reasoning for this inclusion, because you get to see how the area looks after Senua overcomes her psychosis and defeating Cert. So all of those horrible things you saw, well, are still horrible and there, but not as bad. These parts of the game are so boring though. This is the worst type of walking simulator where you hold up on the control stick and listen to some maybe interesting voice acting. On this walk back, there isn't anything to even hear. The voices don't do much, it's just quiet. Again, could be intentional with deeper meaning, but it's just not engaging. The structural puzzles don't really differ from the symbol puzzles much, besides being able to physically make something appear, usually a staircase, once a bridge, and once a doorway. They're okay. The trials on the whole are a nice inclusion. It gives the player something different to do. Of the 4, there are 2 standouts, 1 okay one, and 1 bad one. One of the standouts is the swamp trial. You start off wading through waist-high shitwater, doing some puzzles, then going into a house. Your task is to find symbols again, but this time while being chased. The tension of being hounded by what I assume was the mob that warded off Senua as a child for having the plague, while running around trying to find symbols, feels frantic and chaotic. This is also by far the fastest she moves in the game, and that really helps us to feel the panic she is going through. This was one of my favorite parts of Hellblade, even though the emotion it evokes in me is not a fun one to experience. I feel anxious just thinking about it. The Labyrinth is an okay trial. I at least like that you aren't being chased or have to solve a symbol puzzle. The main trick this one pulls is at one point you have to walk back through the door you most recently walked through. If you don't do that, you're forever in a loop of walking interminably slow through the maze. The simple trial is probably the worst, as it doesn't really feel like you're doing anything unique. The gimmick in this one being you can go back and forth between light and dark worlds to help you solve puzzles. The problem is you still have to open up doors from the other side, and you still do the basic find the X like your double D and all you see is a Q.
Darkness and light.
Lastly, we have the darkness trial, and it's fantastic. It utilizes your sense of hearing really well as you navigate through the darkness with the help of Dillion. At one point you hear water, you find the water source, you walk up the river, you find a house, avoid wandering enemies, avoid chains that could alert the enemies, track fire sources, and so on. This evidently is the darkness that Senua experiences throughout her life, that she so rarely is able to overcome. It is said she sometimes gets lost in there for days. This was the only time someone tried to help her, to inspire hope so she could overcome it. This really connected me with Dillion. The earlier flashback sequences did a good job with it, but this showed me through gameplay how important he was. Even afterwards, he doesn't take credit for Senua escaping. He builds her up.
All you needed was a little help.
So not only is this a great trial for the story and character's sake, it's great in its own right for gameplay purposes, benefited directly from the stellar sound design. The sound design in general throughout the game is outstanding. Before I get to the good, let me share the only bad. The subtitles are garbage. To sum up how bad they are, basically if you're deaf, this game isn't playable, straight up. Not only are there no options to customize them, they are just sometimes outright incorrect. Worse than incorrect, there are plenty of voice lines that aren't even included at all.
You've done it. You did it. The warrior trials. Go get the sword. You have to get the sword.
With grammar reforged.
There also aren't any clues on who is currently talking. Most of the time it's the random voices in her head, but when Dillion, a significant character, speaks, I think they should consider that an important piece of information that he's guiding Senua out of her darkness.
Do you see it? No. Then it cannot see you. Quietly move past it. One step.
I get this game was designed for people to play with a headset on, but I think quality subtitles are welcomed in any game. Going along with being deaf, if someone is deaf, the combat sections where enemies are behind you would just be impossible. Now for the positives. The voices in her head were recorded with a 360-degree microphone to make it seem like they are all around you. It's really good, and it aids in the engrossing experience it's striving for. I've already discussed the Darkness Trial, but that is a standout example of how amazing the sound design can be. Even using the noise of crackling fire to guide you feels and sounds great. The voice acting is phenomenal. When I did get a chance to listen to the lore without the worry of it randomly stopping, I was quite enjoying story time with Truth. His voice work is very well done. Dillion's voice seems to purposely stand out among the rest. Everyone else in the game is voiced in a tough, distraught, or otherwise evil way. With Dillion, I can practically hear the compassion and love from his voice. When he's talking to Senua, it could have been so easy for him to sound like he's talking down to her, but every single time you hear the care and you feel the sincerity. Senua is voiced and acted by Melina Juergens. Apparently she was Ninja Theory's editor who was filling in as Senua initially when they decided on using her since she was already fantastic at playing Senua. Great decision. Her acting displays Senua's inner struggles quite well. My favorite voice in the game was Zinbel's. He was Senua's druid father who kept her in isolation, constantly fucked her life up more by saying she's cursed, and burned her mother alive. Fuck him as a character, but his voice is hauntingly amazing. It's extremely low frequency. Have a listen.
What are you doing? You're showing weakness. You're not a warrior. You're a disgrace.
The combat of the game on the whole doesn't have the most depth, but it tries to make up for it in other areas. If I had to make a guess, I would say that Ninja Theory really likes Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, and potentially Shawn Michaels the professional wrestler. I say this because some of the attacks you can perform in the game remind me of those characters. Look at how Aragorn bats away the knife in the Fellowship of the Ring, and how Senua bats away a knife in Hellblade. Her parry to regular attacks feels reminiscent. She also does a stab behind the back, another thing Aragorn does in that film. Now this kick here really feels like the super kick from professional wrestling. But I admit, this one isn't as concrete. This is a real kick. The standing kick, however, is coming right out of Esqueletto's playbook. It's literally his signature move. Can't hide your influences from me, Ninja Theory. If I can be serious for a minute, there are some good visuals and fun gimmicks, specifically in the boss fights. There are some genuinely good audio and visual cues when your enemies are about to strike. Most of the enemy attacks seem to nearly have the same buffer of time when you hear the cue to when you need to dodge or parry. This helps tremendously when enemies are behind Senua and you are alerted to their presence. Once you get the timing down, confidently waiting for a flanking enemy to strike so you can parry them feels good. The best part of it all is it fits so effortlessly with the theme and is diegetic. Senua's inner voices warn her of incoming dangers. In other games, your companions might say, "Watch out," and it sometimes doesn't line up with what the enemy is doing, or it's just some automatic line when an enemy spawns. When I hear the voices shout, "Behind you!" it's almost always followed up by an attack. If you trust the voices and react, you will be rewarded. I think I have a theory. A ninja theory. To why they made the audio cues sometimes so distinct. The camera is very zoomed in on Senua, and you can't see basically anything besides right in front of you. Some of the most intense regular enemy encounters are when multiple enemies are all around you, but that's usually only because you are constantly dodging and parrying from enemies you can't see. Knowing that, I think the audio cues are used as a crutch. The visual cues work just fine if you couldn't hear the audio, but the only way to know if you'll be attacked from behind is with sound. The multiple enemies thing can also be tough depending on the locale you're in. In the River of Blood, I had a hard time discerning things on screen, and was the only time I died in a combat section. I feel like the camera being so zoomed in didn't do me any favors. I was getting overwhelmed with the audio cues for flanking enemies in this section, and I tried to get the enemies all on screen. Watch how long this process takes. I would like more depth to the combat, but only if they can get a better camera distance. Maybe something they can improve on in their next game. One thing they don't need to improve a whole lot on are the boss fights. The early two bosses in the game are decent, Cert being a little bit too easy, but it's possible he could be the player's first boss, so it's okay he's not that hard. His gimmick is needing to focus on him to quench his flame so you can strike him. His visual design is great, and I love how the fire looks in his arena. The Crow Valravan is a good boss that I have one issue with. It has a very uncomfortable and deceitful intro cutscene. Once the camera zooms out, it's clear he's just being a bird, but it almost seems like they try to give off the impression that something else was happening. Gameplay-wise, he is a very fun boss. All of the attacks have good tells before them, one of them is really quick, but it's fair, and it adds good variety. Most of the attacks you can parry, but some need to be dodged. This is the boss that flings knives at you, and that feels great to counter. The animation on his twirly charge attack looks great. He has the trick where at one point you need to focus on him or you can't hit him, much like Cert. A really nice thing about him though is you can parry his knives, and that will do the job as well. So yeah, a good boss, just maybe change that opening cutscene. Fenrir is probably my favorite boss fight in the game, even though it does some things wrong. I love when darkness can be used as an interesting way that doesn't feel cheap. Throughout all of Helheim, you have been chased by this beast anytime you enter the darkness. You've been running into light sources or finding torches to avoid him. In the final confrontation, Senua has had enough and fights to get Dillion's head back. You basically can't hit him when you aren't focused, so you need to constantly be dodging his attacks until your mirror fills up again. He sometimes runs out of view, and you need to use your ears to find out where he's charging from. Sometimes you are blinded outright and need to dodge based solely on his audio. Here's my first issue. The times when you are blinded are amazing, but if you're good at the game, you won't be blinded for very long. In my first playthrough, I was stuck being blind for much longer, and I had to go off only audio for a while, hoping the lightning would strike to brighten the room. It was a transcending experience. This playthrough, I just breezed past these parts, I guess. I still have a love for this fight, but not as strongly as I remembered in 2018. The other issue I have is the ending blow. I don't know how this kind of thing ever makes it past development. If the character ends up killing the boss, the player should also be killing the boss. Instead, it's handled in a cutscene. The worst part about it is your last hits didn't stagger him or cause the cutscene to occur. He just vanishes like normal, grabs Senua from behind, and she whacks him a bit. It doesn't feel as earned as it could have been, especially since he's been plaguing you throughout Helheim. A cathartic release this was not. Those issues aside, his attacks all have good tells, waiting for him to strike from the dark feels tense, and his design is interesting. The final boss of the game is Hela. It's more of a finale sequence if anything, but I'll count it. The fight itself feels rightfully arduous and heroic. The atmosphere is outstandingly well done, the music playing in the background fits the mood well and inspires hope every time you falter. There are 2 arenas where enemies keep coming at you. The first one brings back the bosses in the game for a little while, which are nice to fight again. The second arena is regular enemies and will last until the player dies. I really like that this is a required fail state. The voices in your head are telling you to give up, that it's okay to stop. However, it doesn't sound like her usual voices. I think this time is her mother, maybe?
Let go of your battle. You don't have to fight anymore.
It's the only time a voice other than Dillion's sounds comforting. One problem with the failure state requirement is that the game isn't exactly that challenging. Maybe they should have ramped up the difficulty more here. As far as I can tell, the only thing they do is throw endless enemies at you, while also sometimes disrupting your movement for a brief moment. I guess they were hoping that would be enough, but I managed to go for a long time. I was playing on hard this time, and I still lasted 15 minutes on the second arena, long enough for the song to loop quite a few times. It's also a big shame that you don't even get to fight Hela. I understand that Hela doesn't exist, that all of this is in Senua's head, but the bosses in the game probably don't exist either, and I fought those just fine. Including Hela as the final failure state boss after the hordes of enemies would have been preferred. Before I wrap up, I have to say that the making of documentary in the main menu to be watched after you beat the game is a mixed bag. It's really well done, and seeing all of the ways they consulted mental health specialists and recorded the audio was interesting. But some of the information I received from it was critical for me coming to certain conclusions or even respecting the backstory of Senua. I didn't gather when playing the game that Senua was a Celtic warrior who had Vikings pillage her home village and sacrifice Dillion to their god, Hela. This is what starts Senua's journey, the reason she seeks out Hela in the first place. Maybe I'm just an idiot and should have put the pieces together, but since we're always in the perspective of Senua, things are never clear. Dillion is shown to be sacrificed in a horrific way in a cutscene, but I really wasn't sure if that was a real thing that happened. I think the game could have accomplished so much more if they let the player know of certain aspects of the game that only exist in Senua's psychosis. If you're trying to use the medium of video games as a teaching tool, which it seems like they were, purposefully being unclear on things doesn't let players always understand what is going on. I can imagine some who have played this game that never looked at the making of missed a whole lot of things in the game that were supposed to be psychosis related or didn't even understand the finale sequence at all. One of the testers even said he didn't see the psychosis aspect to the game. The last thing I will say about this is that this is a great way to bring us closer to Senua, to share in her delusions and hallucinations. But never providing an outside lens means we don't know what is real in this Nordic land or what is all in her head. Gods, beasts, and the land of the dead, when talking about Nordic realms, are all on the table, so it leaves us with an unclear message on what besides the symbols, the rot, and Senua's goal are truly imaginary. If you've watched this whole video and still haven't played the game, you've ignored my heat at the beginning, but it's okay. I hope I've convinced you to give this game a shot. There's so much to love about Hellblade, the risk of making an entire game around a mental illness, the stellar sound design that turns the game from good to breathtaking, the symbolism and seamless character exposition of the darkness and swamp trials, the entire Helheim section and one of the best boss fights I've played in a game. Even in the genre of experiential games, this one stands out as something unique. Ninja Theory has shown by example that we can all overcome our darkness and return to the light. His visual design is great, and I love how the fuck off, motorcycle.